I want to thank you all for inviting me back. This is a most blessed place. It's a great honor to be here. I'd like to thank the Whole Church United Christian Church, and of course my good friend, Reverend Bloom, for many, many years of friendship. I'll begin with a short Islamic prayer, which is the opening chapter to the Quran, Al-Fatiha, and then start some discussion on my topic today, which is African American Muslim liberation theology. We come this far by faith. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim Maliki Yawm al-Din. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim. Khayr al-maghdubi alayhim. In the name of Allah, most beneficent, most graceful. Praise to Allah, the beneficent, the merciful Lord of the worlds, Master of the Day of Judgment. Thee do we worship, in thine aid we seek. Lead us in the right path, the path of those you have guided, not the path of those who have led astray or who have incurred thy wrath. Again, this is the day that the Lord has made. We shall rejoice and be glad in it. We come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord. These are the words and sentiments of the African American ancestors and of the faithful today. But just what is faith? What is faith to the African American in general, and what does it mean to have faith and be an African American Muslim? Also, how is faith liberating? To address these questions, Allah willing, we will journey a bit through the tragic events of the enslavement period and travel through the various African American coping strategies for wellness, I'd like to call them. In the words of the great Philadelphia gospel singer, Clara Ward, in one of her famous gospel hymns, How I Got Over, she spoke to a question from a great universal inquiry. How I got over, how I got over, my soul looks back and wonders how I got over, how we got over, Lord, how we got over. My soul looks back and wonders how we got over. In 2019, Congress enacted the 400 Years of African American History Commission. The purpose of the commission was for Americans to commemorate 400 years, that's 1619 to 2019, of African American presence in Anglo-American history. In 1619, a ship with some 20 enslaved African captives landed in Virginia. This now is part of the Fort Monroe National Monument. Briefly, there were other significant congressional acts of civil rights legislation that may have influenced the lives of certain African Americans, in particular the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which extended the rights of formerly enslaved, and again in 1871 provided for a remedy for the continual actions of the Ku Klux Klan. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, a public accommodations law, passed by Congress, was primarily declared unconstitutional in 1883. During the Reconstruction era, in response to the civil rights violations of Americans, the President's grant signed into law in 1875 an act to protect the citizens for their civil rights and this was declared ineffective, primarily because of President Grant's decision that he had some better options. We're not sure if that was true or not. The Reconstruction era ended with the resolution of the 1876 presidential election and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This was the last federal act until the passage of the Civil Rights Act 100 years later in 1975. The courts held that the 13th Amendment was meant to eliminate bondage of slavery, but not to prohibit the racial discrimination in public accommodations. These laws were finally in 1968 resolved under what was called the Commerce Clause, which allowed then for people who were traveling in different locations to come under the laws of civil rights. They used the Commerce Law. Some of the remaining civil rights legislation, 1957, established the Civil Rights Commission. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 established federal inspections for local voter registrations. The Act of 64, which prohibited discrimination against race, color, sex, and national origin. And 1968 established the Fair Law in Housing and Equal Opportunity Act in 1972. It's a lot of acts, right? It wasn't that they couldn't get it right, it just took a amount of time. It doesn't talk about the lack of spirit or will on part of the people in the nation. It's just that in order to come together in a sense of unity and still take care of the particular interests of the South and the particular interests of the African Americans, there had to be some agreement on how to approach. So that there was not to look back and to say what was happening, why couldn't they get it right? What was happening was a country was growing and learning how to deal with differences. A particular interest was the Voting Right Act of 1965. It removed the barriers to black disenfranchisement in the South, banning the poll tax, literary tests, and other measures that effectively permitted African Americans from voting. Congress enacted the Voting Rights Act in 65, and again in 1970, and in 75, in 82, in 1992, and in 2006. What happened is there were certain portions of the act that had to be constantly renewed. These were provisions that enabled the voting rights that kept people from going to the polls. Remember, I talked earlier about the poll taxes and the other kinds of ways of literacy tests. Every so often, the act has to be reenacted in order to include those provisions. I think the next time that it has to be reviewed is in 2031. So it's a constant renewal of the rights to keep the states and other places from putting poll taxes and having different tests in order to keep people from voting. This is especially important with the large increasing number of immigrants, especially from Spanish-speaking communities. If you could then say, well, you can't vote because you can't speak English, or you can't vote because we have a tax here, because you're an immigrant, you have to pay an extra tax. So in order to keep these kinds of things from occurring, the Voting Rights Act has to be reauthorized. Again, the next time is in 2031. In 2006, the president signed into law the Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, and Coretta Scott King Voting Rights Act, reauthorization. The Amendment Act of 2006. The Voting Rights Act broke the segregation back against the, you remember the march in Selma, Alabama? Mm-hmm. On that day, John Lewis marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in protest to the highlights of the unfair practices that were kept off the people being kept off the voter rolls. The brutal response showed America why a march was necessary. When the marchers marched the far side of the bridge, they were met by state troopers and civilian posses bearing billiard clubs, and peaceful protesters were attacked. This was televised across the country, and the country was stunned by the abhorrence of the visions they saw. 1 week after Selma, President Lyndon Johnson took on a grave the airways, to announce that he planned to submit legislation for an act that would bring Americans into the full civic life of our nation. 5 months after Selma, he signed the Voting Rights Act into law in the rotunda of the nation's capital. In a little more than a year after Selma, the newly enfranchised black community used its power in the ballot box to help defeat the sheriff who had sent the men to whip the clubs to the Edmund Pettus Bridge on that 11th Sunday. So, one of the songs that people used to sing was "Son Will Be Done." Soon all will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, troubles of the world. Soon all will be done with the troubles of the world. Gone home to live with God. Soon all will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, troubles of the world. Soon all will be done with the troubles of the world. Gonna home to live with my Lord. No more weeping and wailing. No more weeping and wailing. No more weeping and wailing. Gonna home to live with God. Give me a second. There's power in the word. There's power in the word. But what is faith? What is faith to African Americans in general? And what does it mean to have faith as an African American Muslim? And how is faith liberating? King James tells us, through the Apostle Paul in Hebrews, now faith is that substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. From an Islamic perspective, faith is a gift from Allah given to the believers. Quoting, "It is He who has sent down tranquillities into the hearts of the believer that they may add faith to their faith. For to Allah belongs the forces of the heavens and the earth, and Allah is full of knowledge and wisdom." From both an African American Christian and African American Muslim perspective, faith is based in part on prophetic revelation. For a Christian, it is based upon the words and actions of the Prophet Jesus. For the Muslim, it is based on absolute trust in Allah. the glorious Quran and the revelations of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, in the 6th century of the Common Era. In both examples, trust is placed in the Lord of hosts, the most compassionate, the most merciful of us all. Now, for me, the best examples of African American faith leaders, in my opinion, are the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, known primarily as Malcolm X. I entitled this part of the conversation, Malcolm and Martin, Two Voices, One Song in Perfect Harmony. Both of these men were proponents of African American liberation theology. Dr. King's Southern strategy message based upon the liberation of his people through redemptive suffering. Using the metaphor of the cross. Dr. King appeared to share philosophy with the Holocaust camp survivors, in particular, Dr. Viktor Frankl. Dr. Frankl's psychological approach to wellness was to find meaning in unavoidable suffering. A methodology that he called logotherapy. Dr. King, in part, wanted to remind Christians of Jesus' message, "This is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. And blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Dr. King wanted to prick the consciousness and feelings of shame and guilt in the Southern Christians through a vehicle of nonviolence. Nonviolence, liberation through nonviolence. This concept of liberation theology. Hajj Malik's concept of the African American Muslim liberation theology was separation from the people he called the devil, and people who lynched, raped, murdered, and segregated and kept African Americans in poverty and were slumlords in the North. Hajj Malik believed in part that the white man as a collective consciousness was the very definition of evil and had no possibility of redemption, in contrast to Dr. King. He believed that the separation was the only answer, and he further developed his Islamic beliefs along traditional lines as he became more mature in his understanding of Islam. He eventually created two different organizations, one called the Muslim Mosque, Inc., and the other one called the Organization of African American Unity. Dr. King and El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz were African Americans who developed from contrasting educational families, economic and social traditions. Both were ministers in their respective religious traditions. Dr. King hailed from an middle-class family, slightly upper class, because of his father's position as a senior pastor in a huge congregation. Hajj Malik came from a Christian family of modest means. Both men had fathers who were ministers. Dr. King spent his childhood in the segregated South of the Ku Klux Klan. He knew arbitrary lynchings and experienced limited civil rights and limited social privileges. Hajj Malik knew the Ku Klux Klan from personal attacks on his family in Omaha, Nebraska. He fell into the social trap of drugs and criminal culture of the North, and subsequently had a spiritual and moral transformative awakening in the Nation of Islam. Eventually, he saw African American liberation not as only a civil rights issue, excuse me, but also as an African American challenge to international human rights, worthy of the United Nations consideration, liberation by any means necessary. Last month, January 20th, the nation celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It is the only American national holiday named for an individual. The holiday is a testament to Dr. King's commitment to his people, his religion, and to what he referred to as the beloved community of America. He once stated in a speech, "Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our lives." Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz is hardly remembered at all by the nation. When he is, it appears that there's some controversy or misgiving about who he was and his role in American history. His contributions are even ignored by non-African American Muslims and by some of the African American Christians in the culture. Nevertheless, he personifies a personal collective change in African American Muslim theology, now, then. May Allah continue to reward his according to the best of his actions. In closing, we commemorate, remember, and cogitate 400 years of African American presence in the English colonies and subsequently the United States of America. We should not forget our forefathers and foremothers who lost their lives in the trans-Africa, transatlantic, trans-America slave trade. We should not forget the heroes and the sheroes who fought the good fight, who finished the race, and who kept the faith. We have come this far by faith, 2020, and we've kept the faith. African American liberation theology, as exemplified by Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the beloved country and civil rights, have contributed tremendously to this country. Quoting Dr. King from his March on Washington speech, "Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children." How did we get over? How did we get over? We got over by faith. And we have come this far by faith. Thank you very much.